Well, you might have thought it was a little bit of an unusual title, A Seat at the Christmas Table. Now, I noticed that we have one person here who's wearing red today. I didn't know if that had to do with the Christmas theme or not, but probably. That's right. Well, we appreciate you wearing that, and you'll figure out in a minute where the whole Christmas thing comes from. Several weeks ago, you may recall that we read Paul's account of what must have been a very awkward and embarrassing episode for the church at Antioch. He called out Peter for his table manners. You remember that? Now, the rebuke wasn't for something like having his elbows on the table or chewing with his mouth open. It wasn't something along those lines. But it concerned where Peter chose not to sit. You remember that? Paul saw hypocrisy in Peter sitting with his Jewish counterparts who had come from Jerusalem to Antioch, instead of continuing to mix it up with uncircumcised Gentile Christians. Suffice it to say that where and with whom Peter chose to sit spoke volumes to Paul about the level of true inclusiveness in Peter's heart. Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to read this without sensing a little bit of a spirit of judgmentalism in Paul, but it was this whole thing of the inclusion of Gentiles, heartily so, was such a big deal with Paul that he wasn't willing to let Peter's, what he considered negative example, go without some response. Now, even though in our text today there is no mention of tables or meals, the matter of being welcomed and included and belonging is front and center. You understand what I mean? There's no tables mentioned, there's no food involved here, but in the background is important information about belonging. If you want to be technical about it, it's called the meta language of the text. Now, I think with some context and some background this morning, you're going to find our text today to be very accessible and especially meaningful. It certainly has been to me as I have studied it and prepared for today. Now, we don't need to spend a lot of time this morning talking about the centuries-old tradition of sitting and dining with others. We talked a lot about that several weeks ago when we were preaching about the text related to Paul's challenge of Peter. The communal concept of sharing a meal with someone is a centuries-old tradition. Here's a good example. If you look at the 23rd Psalm, you notice that among several important images in the 23rd Psalm is that of a table that the psalmist writes is being prepared for him in the presence of his enemies. You think of a bedraggled kind of traveler who is moving just ahead of some enemy or enemies, and he comes upon a tent in the desert where he is treated as a beloved guest. Not only is a table prepared, but oil, which is a kind of soothing experience from all of the sand and grit and sunburn that one might experience, and So he's welcomed at a table. It's an important image of acceptance and security. You go to the New Testament, the premier example of the idea of the communion and the intimacy of a table we find in the Gospels, where Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, sat with his disciples and shared with them his deepest and most intimate thoughts. And what has happened as a result of that gathering? Well, for 2,000 years of Christian history, we have continued to remember a symbolic table where the spilt blood and the broken body of Christ are represented, but also there's a representation of the fact that you and I share Christ in common. And so we have that background, we have those images in our minds. I want you this morning, beyond that, to make sure that you note Paul's Christmas story. You see, it's not just in Luke and Matthew and symbolically in the Gospel of John. No, Paul has his own Christmas story, and it is right here in our text. And this is, I know that I have preached this text at Christmas time, and it's kind of an odd time of the year to be talking about Christmas. It's 5 months away, or if you get anxious about such things, it's only 5 months away if you're wanting to plan ahead. And Lord knows the weather is no help for turning our imaginations this morning to late December, but I want you to try to do that anyway. In the text, Paul tells us that when the time was right, according to the purpose of God, Jesus arrived on the scene. Now, Paul doesn't, give us all the background of Mary and Joseph. He just says very, very plainly that when the fullness of time was come, over the centuries, people have speculated as to what exactly Paul meant by that. Some have said, well, it was a propitious time for Jesus to be born because of a common language across the Roman Empire, the Greek language. And also, there was something in the world of the first century known as the Pax Romana. Anybody know what that is? It's the peace of Rome. And because of the power of the Roman Empire, people were able to travel a little more freely than they might have been otherwise. And somebody might be so practical as to say, yeah, and they had good roads back in those days as well because of the Roman civil engineering feats. I think that you can still see some of those, the ruins of some of those roads. But the truth is, we don't know why the time was perfect or the time was right for the coming of Jesus. I've often thought about that myself. Why at this particular time? Well, it doesn't make any difference, really. Paul, look at it this way. According to the sovereign knowledge and purposes of God, the time was right for Jesus to be born, as we know, in Bethlehem. Paul doesn't mention Bethlehem. He just says that Jesus was born under the law, meaning that Jesus was born a Jew. He was fully human. He had a birth just like every other human being has. And I think that Paul is, if you had asked Paul about the statement, he would have said, look, folks, I just want you to know that Jesus was a real person. He was born at a real time and in a real place. And Jesus' purpose was to deliver humanity under the slavery of sin. Now, when Paul talks about the bondage under which people were living, when he talks about Jewish people, he talks about the weight of the law that was impossible to fulfill. When he talks about Gentiles, he talks about them being in bondage to the elemental spirits of the world. And we're not sure at all what Paul meant by that. Some have speculated. You might find it interesting that astrology was a big thing in the world of the first century. Anybody want to guess what country was into astrology more than any other place in the Middle East? Anybody want to guess? Iran. The Persian Empire had something called Zoroastrianism. And a lot of people were convinced that somehow the stars and the heavenly bodies scripted their lives in some way. That's just one example. The big point to notice is that Jesus coming, whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, was meant to provide liberation for you under whatever kind of bondage it was that you suffered. And so in our text, the social status of slaves, sons, and heirs is important for the point that Paul is driving home. Now, it's been a long time since I studied the whole matter, but I remember at one point, somebody speculated that about 40%, it's hard to believe, about 40% of the Roman population were slaves. Now, that's a lot of slaves. I mean, it could have been more, it could have been less, but slavery was widespread. Now, it wasn't the kind of slavery that you might think about related to the American South. It was different. People could buy their way out of slavery, or they could serve as a slave for X number of years and then go on their happy way. But it was a big thing. It was a big part of the Roman Empire. Slavery was widespread in the Roman Empire, and like everyone else, slaves had families and bore children, just like all other human beings. And here's the thing. If a slave owner did not have a male child, this was under Roman law, if a slave owner did not have a male child, then that slave owner had the prerogative of adopting one of his slave's sons after the boy came of age. So at age 12, one of the slave's sons could be adopted by the slave owner. Now, I can imagine all kinds of perilous emotional issues related to that. That's not hard to imagine. But think about this. That young man at age 12, he instantly shed his slave status to put on the rights and privileges of being a son, as though he had been born as the biological offspring of his new father. And so not only did you become the son of someone else, But in becoming the son, you realized all kinds of great benefits. The son became a full heir of the father's inheritance, or the father's possessions. I should say, the son would inherit the family's possessions. Now, I would not have been pleased at all with the Roman system, because in the Roman system, the oldest son inherited. See, I'm the second born, and so I would have had to depended upon my older brother's generosity in order for me to get a piece of the pie. And do we have any are you an oldest son, Will? Okay, man, you're out of luck. How about you, Raymond? Are you the oldest son in your family? Boy, you're out of luck, friend. Ray, how about you? You the oldest? Okay, all right. Ray would have been the golden boy. I mean, he would have scored. Anybody over here the oldest sibling? Okay. You know, with being the oldest sibling, you have some responsibilities, so don't shirk it off, man. Those younger siblings are depending upon you. But the Roman culture, there were some very positive things about it, but there were also some things that just make us scratch our heads and wonder how in the world you could endure such a system. For the son of a slave becoming the slave owner's son, it was like winning the lottery. I mean, wow, all of a sudden you have a whole different status. 60 years ago this fall, on Columbus Day, as a matter of fact, Columbus Day 1966, whatever that date was, I think it used to always be observed on the 12th. Maybe not, maybe so. But on Columbus Day, 60 years ago, my brother and my mother and we met our dad over at a place called the Edna Gladney home in Fort Worth. My dad was driving from work to meet us there. And here's why. Less than 2 months earlier, my mother had noticed the most beautiful, tiny baby girl, maybe 2 weeks old, maybe 3 weeks, something like that. Noticed this beautiful baby girl in the church nursery, brought there by her foster mother, who was also a member of our church back then. Both of my parents fell in love with this tiny, dark-headed, dark-eyed girl. I mean, she looked just like the rest of us. I mean, it was just fascinating. They fell in love with this little girl. And before long, they asked my brother and me if we would like a baby sister. Now, back then, I didn't know you could just go pick out one, My older brother tells me that when I was born, he was about 3. He has a memory of this. He said he remembers my mom and dad, they were driving an old 54 Chevy, and they pulled up in front of the hospital, kind of a circular place, and the nurse, my mother, rolled down the window and handed me to my mother. My brother thought it was like one of these drive-in diners where you just go and you order some burgers and fries and they bring it out to you, He was pretty perplexed by it. Wow, I got a new brother, Well, I wasn't quite that naive myself back then, but I very quickly learned about this matter of adoption, and I had seen the little girl, and when they asked us, would you like to have a baby sister? Of course we would. Were they kidding? And so on that day in 1966, with a stroke of the pen, that little girl became our little sister. On that day, all it took was, the stroke of a pen made it official. There was, they had to interview us and all of that, but she became a part of our family as though she had been born to the biological union of my mother and my dad. But, I say with the stroke of a pen, but this was not just some kind of legal fiction, that she was truly a part of our family. Why was it not it wasn't a legal fiction, because there was an incredible, heartfelt intimacy there. I remember when we brought her home on that Columbus Day. I was supposed to go to football practice, and I asked my mother, could I miss football practice and just stay here and look at my sister? And she said, no, you need to go on to practice, it's all right and all. And I just remember how deeply in love I was with her. Now, in our text, Paul speaks of our adoption as believers in this way. And I think largely he's talking about talking to the Gentile group. And Paul goes on to say in our text that the Holy Spirit, when we come to faith in Christ, God adopts us as a child, but the Spirit does such a work of transformation in our hearts that we come to refer to God with Abba, Father. You know what Abba means? It's an Aramaic word. It is more intimate than father or papa or dad. It's more like something that a very small child might say to their parent. When we FaceTime with our little granddaughter out in Colorado, who will be 1 next month, this time next month we'll be in Colorado for that big birthday, where she puts her face in the cake and all that. That's did Isaac do that when y'all he got to put his face in the cake? I don't know why that got to be such a deal, but I don't know, it's part of a tradition now. But where was I? What was I telling you about? I know what it is. She started making a lot of noises with her mouth, and the other day it sounded so much like Dada. But she's going to call him Papa, so it was our imagination, And before long, we just know she's going to come out with Grandma or Grandpa while we're looking at her on FaceTime. But Paul says in our text that the Spirit seals our adoption as children. And, I think about the level of intimacy that was maintained over many years. And by the way, my sister went through some very rough times and gave my parents a hard time at various points of her life. And she's deeply regretful of that. And she acknowledged it over the years and certainly apologized for it. But as my parents were getting older, I was visiting down there one day, and my sister called my dad, and my mother said, every day, 5 days a week, when Linda is on her way home from work, she calls your dad and wants to know how they're doing. So the intimacy there remained. And it's a beautiful picture here for us. Now, it wasn't until Linda was almost grown that she met her biological mother. Her mother, turns out, was a depressed alcoholic living in a small trailer on her father's property out somewhere. We found out that she had given birth to Linda when she was 15 years old. After that, the lady had 2 more children by 2 different fathers, and she had a silver dollar-sized scar on her stomach that marked the spot where she had been shot in a barroom altercation. Now, once we learned all that and I pondered that, it helped me to see that God had used our family in a remarkable way to rescue her from all of that. You think about that for a moment. God had used our family. And Linda didn't have to earn the right to be the child of Jim and Dorothy Cogburn. No, she didn't have to earn the right to have a place at the table at dinner time. And when we had family celebrations, she didn't do anything to earn that. It was by God's grace. My parents chose her. They had to get what they got with my brother and me, but they chose her. They chose her. This week, Linda and I, this is really timely, at least for me personally. This week, Linda and I will be meeting with a lawyer online to help settle our parents' estate, because guess what? She is a full heir as much as I am. And so I think it's a wonderful illustration of what Paul is talking about here. Now, people who know about such things say that it's important for healthy families to have at least one meal together every day. Well, that gets hard, when kids have band and athletics and scouting and this and that. It gets hard, but it's worth the effort, I would submit to you. Laura and I tried to do that when our kids were young. And you know what? Today, there are few things that are more joyful for Laura and me than to have our son and daughter with their families back at our table where they eternally are welcome. And this year, it is especially true because at the time when we gather at Christmas to celebrate the birth of the one that God sent to liberate us from the power of darkness and the power of sin, when we celebrate that, to make possible our adoption into the kingdom, this year at Christmas, Juliet is scheduled to make her appearance. So we'll have that we'll bring her here. We certainly want you to see her, because there's no beautiful little girl in the history of humanity than the one that has been born our grandchild. No, you've got some you're pretty proud of as well. But it deeply warms my heart when I read a text from Paul that talks about salvation in terms of someone choosing and lovingly adopting me as a child. And not only a child, but an heir. Somebody who, I'm who I am because God loved me. God adopted me as a child. And as a believer, you are the same way. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.